So this Shabbos is Yud Shvat, the 10th of Shvat, which is a very important date for us in the Chabad calendar, and it's especially important this year because Yud Shvat is the Yahrzeit of the Frierdiker Rebbe in 1950, and then it's the anniversary of when the Rebbe formally accepted to become the Rebbe 1 year later, which means that this year we're commemorating the 70th anniversary of when the Rebbe became the Rebbe, which is quite a big deal. And there's a lot of interesting history around it, how exactly the process worked, and the year in between, which was literally an in-between stage. On the one hand, there were many Hasidim who pushed the Rebbe quite hard that he should take the position, and on the other hand, there was a lot of pushback from the Rebbe that he didn't want to take the position. Very interesting stories of different individuals and how they approached the Rebbe to try and convince him, and wrote documents saying, we're committed, we'll be your Hasidim if you'll be our Rebbe, etc. Until eventually, when it came to the Farbrengen for the Yahrzeit of the Frierdiker Rebbe, first Yahrzeit, so at that point, there was a lot of speculation whether or not something was going to happen, and whether or not that would be the moment that the Rebbe would say, okay, fine, I'm going to take the leadership, and say a mimer. A mimer is like an original Hasidic discourse. That's the sign of a Rebbe, as opposed to quoting from predecessors and so on. So the Rebbe talks a lot. The Rebbe talks a lot about this date and about what it means to us. And in the early talks of the Rebbe, he speaks of it very much in the context of the previous Rebbe. He talks a lot about what the Frierdiker Rebbe's personality was about, what his leadership style was about. Really interesting. And one of the things that the Rebbe points out is that there's no such thing as Jewish leaders who are effectively carbon copies of each other. Even though we have a principle which says, Ispashtusa de Moshe b'chol dora, that Moshe is the ultimate Jewish leader, and all the main Jewish leaders, the great tzaddikim of history, are effectively the Moshe of that particular generation. So that gives you the sense that there's definitely a common thread that runs through all of the different mega tzaddikim of history. Yet at the same time, the Rebbe says each one is absolutely individual, and each one focuses on a particular approach within Judaism. There's a Gemara that says, one rabbi asked the other rabbi, Avuch b'mai hava zohir tvei. Your father, what was he most scrupulous about? In other words, the implication is, I know that your father did all the mitzvahs. Obviously, your father's a great rabbi, and he's a great tzaddik, and obviously he was absolutely committed to Hashem on every level. But out of all of the mitzvahs that you do, every person has a particular mitzvah that speaks to them and resonates with them more than all the other mitzvahs. There's actually a play on words over here, because the word zahir means to be very careful and scrupulous, and the word zahir also comes from the word to shine, like the word zohar, which means to shine. So when you have a particular, every one of us has this. There's a particular part of Judaism that's like your favorite part of Judaism, the part that you find to be the most meaningful, the part that really stimulates your neshama. And through that, zahir, that's what causes an individual to shine. So by the same token, each Rebbe was zahir, was particularly focused on and particularly shone through a particular area of Torah, a particular way of sharing Torah. So the Rebbe, talking about his predecessor, about his father-in-law, the Frierdiker Rebbe, says, what was his zahir tvei? What was his uniqueness? That kind of sets him apart from everybody who came before him. Now, there are many things we could talk about in terms of the Frierdiker Rebbe, and probably one of the most notable things that we could talk about is the Frierdiker Rebbe's activities behind the Iron Curtain, because he lived at the height of Stalin's rule, and he spent 10 years of his leadership dodging the KGB, until eventually he was able to leave. Well, not able to, they kind of forced his hand and got him out of Russia. So it was a very, very difficult period of time. And even after the Frierdiker Rebbe left, the network that he had created in the communist regime, under their noses, remained in place until the fall of communism in 1990. So it's quite a thing. You could easily say that's the Frierdiker Rebbe's big thing, was preserving Judaism under fire in one of the most difficult periods of history, the crossover from the Holocaust into the real heavy times of Stalinist Russia, or both, actually. I mean, Stalinist Russia actually was before the Holocaust. By the time the Holocaust came, the Frierdiker Rebbe was out of Russia already. So you could easily say that that's like the big deal of the Frierdiker Rebbe's life. But the Rebbe points out something very interesting. He said two things that the Frierdiker Rebbe wanted to achieve. The first is that he wanted to make sure that things actually happened, as we say in the expression in Hebrew, b'poel mamash, practically. That means to say that you could have great ideas and big philosophies, and you could teach all kinds of things, but at the end of the day, those ideals have to translate into practice. So, again, if you go back to the communist period, they had to translate the ideal of sacrifice for Judaism, which all of us learn about and we talk about, and we put it on a pedestal and we say it's the greatest level that a person could ever achieve. And Rabbi Akiva, before he died, said, my whole life I looked forward to having this opportunity, and b'chol nafshecha, to be able to serve Hashem with all your soul, and so on and so forth. I mean, we talk so much about it, but at that period of history, at the time of the communist crackdown against Judaism under Stalin, it was the translation of that principle into poel mamash, into practice. And literally people sacrificed their lives, literally, because they were carted away to Siberia and many times never heard of again. And as one guy would be arrested, so another chassid would come and take his place. It was an incredible kind of thought. The second point that the Rebbe says is that the Frierdiker Rebbe didn't just want to have poel mamash, practical action, but behispashtus yoiser, with the greatest expanse, meaning to say, don't be satisfied with what you've achieved in your domain, in your area, in your sphere of influence, but go out there and make sure that you spread things as widely as possible and touch the broadest audience as possible. And it's probably fair to say that that would be not only in Russia, because we know that after the previous Rebbe came eventually to the United States, he immediately began to send people to represent Chabad in different places in the States, and even the beginnings of sending people abroad. And that's clearly something that the Rebbe took on as his mission statement, to spread Yiddishkeit as far as possible. And then the Rebbe makes an interesting observation, and that's really what I'd like to focus on between today and tomorrow, please God. And that is that he says, when it comes to, so here you are, you're trying to get poel mamash. Poel mamash means not just to have another person over for a Friday night meal, and not just to be nice and friendly to them, but poel mamash, that you should have a real influence on a person's life, that they should actually adopt a mitzvah or another mitzvah, or more Torah learning, and so on and so forth. Poel mamash, practical, that it should actually have an effect on them. And be spashtus, to the broadest possible audience. So if those are the two things that you're looking to achieve, effectively you could drill it down to a principle which is called, what we call today, Jewish outreach. Go out there and bring Yiddishkeit to as many people as you possibly can. When the previous Rebbe came to America, originally, the idea of Jewish outreach was unheard of. Completely unheard of. You have to remember that people at that stage were trying to put their lives together after the Holocaust. You have to remember that to live as a Jewish person in America in the early 1950s and the late 1940s was incredibly, incredibly difficult. There were so many challenges to things like observing Shabbos, if you wanted to keep a job, and so on and so forth. You have to remember also that the Reform movement was very established in the United States before big pockets of Jewish organizations, Torah organizations, arrived in the United States. So there was a huge challenge, and many of the communities felt that they just had to kind of hunker down and look after their own and preserve themselves in the face of an incredible challenge. And the previous Rebbe said, no, you've got to do Jewish outreach. It was completely radical at that point in time. Today, in today's world, across the board, everybody believes in it. Doesn't matter, it could be Chassidish, Haredi, Sephardi, Ashkenazi. Everybody is engaged with the process of Jewish outreach, and highly successfully. There are many, many successful organizations throughout the world and throughout the whole spectrum of the Jewish world. Yet, there's something that the Frierdiker Rebbe taught, which is unique and very much, I think, what makes the Chabad approach Zohir Tvei. What the Chabad approach is so uniquely dedicated to and focused on that perhaps not every other organization in Jewish outreach does. And the Rebbe says it's something we learn from Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, Moshe Rabbeinu. What do we learn from Moshe Rabbeinu? We learn that the first thing that Moshe did for the Jewish people is he did good things for them physically. He took them out of Egypt. He split the sea for them. Of course, it's all as Hashem's representative. But the fact is that the first thing he does is he shows kindness to the people. Let me help you with your problems. You've got a problem right now that you're in Egypt. So let me help you get out of Egypt. And you have a problem now that you're out of Egypt because you're afraid that the Egyptians are going to come back and they're going to recapture you and take you back. So let me ensure that there are no further Egyptians who could ever threaten you. And now you're worried because we're in a desert and how you're going to survive against the extreme experience of the desert. Don't worry, we'll supply you with clouds of glory that will protect you, and they'll keep the climate control, and they'll make sure that you're not exposed to the snakes and scorpions. And then you're worried about the fact, what are you going to eat and what are you going to drink? Don't worry. You don't have to worry about eating food and drink because I'm going to supply you with a manna and I'm going to supply you with water. And only after all of that, when he's looked after them, then he starts to say, and now there's a Torah that you have to follow as well. So in other words, the approach is first you help people in their real physical, personal needs. And after that, after you've, so to speak, created a personal relationship, then you can start to talk about spirituality and Yiddishkeit. And that's something that needs to be understood because some people feel that that is an inappropriate approach. So we'll have a look at that, please God, tomorrow.